welcome back to the questions and answers part for session 10 concerning economic development. The first two questions actually go quite well together because the answer to the second one has something to do with the answer to the first one. So the first question is regarding economic development. As you mentioned in the lecture, there are many points of view about what is development. I'm curious whether Marxism or Gramscianism still have some meaning in the context of economic development. And so first, the very short answer is there are still a lot of authors out there that are, at least in a wider sense, Marxist. So you find very few that are Marxist in the sense of orthodox Marxism of the Eastern Bloc countries. However, there are many scholars, particularly in IPE, that relate to some Marxist theorists, particularly to Antonio Gramsci. And this are particularly many of those that are grouped as critical theorists. So in not so much in post-development theory, but in dependency theory and world systems theory, you find a lot of Marxist thoughts. And not only there is this whole school of thinking in international relations or IPE that's referred to as neo-Gramscianism, which is not that much about the Marxist analysis in the very, very stricter sense. They do still have a class analysis. However, what they oftentimes focus on is this notion of hegemony. The idea of hegemony is that hegemony is a form of social domination in which those that are dominated kind of agree to the domination because they to some extent hold the same beliefs as the dominators, and these beliefs legitimize the whole mode of domination. And I'll briefly explain this a little bit more by answering the second question. So your second question was, there are many criteria for economic development. However, the importance of every element could be different depending on what country is discussed. To what extent is it useful to try to develop a general concept of economic development? And here the Gramscian answer would be, it's useful in the sense that it is a struggle for power and domination. So having a certain notion of development means defining what is thought of as desirable. So if everyone agrees that a high GDP is all that we should be looking for, then we all act in a frame of thinking in which just having a high GDP is the ultimate goal for every country, and every other goal is auxiliary at best. So having a good education system is not an end in itself. It's only good insofar as it helps you getting your GDP up. So this notion of development that we have then defines the goals that we define for our economic policies. If, however, we take another notion of development, for example, the HDI, then we will see the education system and the healthcare system and nutrition, because those are things that make you live longer, as ends in themselves, because they are part of the notion of development. So you can, of course, argue, well, every country is different and every country should decide for themselves what they want. And this is, of course, true. However, the actions that individual governments take, the actions that are positively or negatively sanctioned by international organizations, they all depend on what kind of notion of development you have. So if you want to act in a way that there are changes here, you might want to say, well, every country for themselves. However, you can also say, no, we have to move away from this notion of GDP as being the best measure for development, and move to something else that is universally true for all human beings. And this is a very, very strong claim. And then you can, on the one hand, you can discuss, is this really so? Is it really so that every human being desires living longer and having higher education? And those are difficult normative debates. However, if you look at it politically, from a Gramscian perspective, then you say, well, pushing this point will strengthen certain positions that you might find desirable. For example, the positions of those that suffer from bad distributions in countries. And so for them it might be beneficial to move away from the whole focus on GDP, because this is only a meme, and you move towards a different measure of development in which it's not just the mean of the per capita income in the country, but it also takes into account the distribution. So you can argue from a Gramscian perspective at least that the struggle for a certain notion of development is not something that's merely academic or philosophical, but that it is also a form of struggle for social power and domination, and a struggle for hegemony. So you have it right there. In that sense, at least, Marxism and Gramscianism are still relevant to the discussions of development. The next three questions from three different students also relate to the same question. So the first asks how necessary is the HDI as a real-world use, not only symbolically. As the statistics show, the GDP is a very good indicator. So the argument here goes, well, if there's such a good correlation between the two, why do we even want to look at the HDI if in the end it's basically the same? Because then the question goes on, the HDI is less reliable because it's more complicated and the data is harder to generate accurately, especially in poorer countries, and it seems to be imperfect as well. So the argument goes, well, the GDP is just good enough, the HDI is not different, and it makes it even more complicated because it's very hard to actually measure the life expectancy in Somalia, let's say, because the state is not so good at keeping statistics of everyone who is born or dying in the country. Second student says, the HDI was, in my opinion, a big improvement from only taking the GDP to measure development, but now, about 30 years later, it seems outdated to me too, because it is not complex enough. There are already quite a number of alternative approaches, like the Grand National Happiness Index or the Happy Planet Index. And so the argument here goes exactly the other way around. You argue, well, the GDP was bad, the HDI might be a little bit better, but can't we even do better than that? Does this really reflect what we want for human beings? And next question, similar to that, the idea of the GDP came from the US. The HDI was developed in Northern Europe, and for example, the Gross National Happiness Index is a development measurement in Bhutan. I think that it is interesting regarding the question if there should be a universal index. I think different countries just put an emphasis on different issues, which is good, and there shouldn't be an evaluation of which index is better or worse. So we have three very different approaches here from three different students, and I think there is some merit to all of these points. And to those who doubt that it is good to have a general index, just think that institutions such as the World Bank or the IMF, they have to decide on certain policies, and they have billions and billions of dollars to give away to some countries, and they have to decide where to give them, where they are needed most, where they will be used best. And so they need some base for deciding that. And if they then say, well, every country can define themselves how this will be defined, then we have a problem. And also in other kind of ways, if we want to, as a country, decide what kind of policies do we engage in, then you need some data on international comparison, what leads to what results. And to get these kinds of studies, it's very complicated if you just say, well, every country decides their own path they take in, their own goal, and then it becomes very hard to compare anything. So from a scholarship perspective, it's much better to have one universal measure, and it's even better if this is very easily available, and this is actually the best case that you can make for just using the GDP, because that's just more available than the others. However, it comes with limitation because it means that more money in the country is better. One side note here, it is also true for poorer countries that the calculation of the GDP is quite calculated, because if there are a lot of informal economic relations, and if not every purchase or every work that's done is done officially and is registered with the tax office, then it also gets very difficult to get this. So there are good cases for all these scenarios, and in the end, as I said before, it has something to do with political effects that they will have, and also with struggles for power here. Next question. As I understood, post-development theory states that countries are not more or less developed, but there are in fact only countries. However, I wondered, though one surely can fight the notion of development, one can hardly dismiss the fact that the countries which are usually regarded as such are the politically, economically, or culturally influential ones. Therefore, I wanted to ask if we can, should, or do not want to disclaim or rate countries on their development. In what should or could we regard the dominance of some over many of them? So what I portrayed there was, of course, a very short caricature version of those approaches, and post-development theory does not say there's only countries. They, of course, see that there are hierarchies in the world, and they also see that there are countries in which no people are starving, and there are countries in which many people are starving, and nobody says, well, if you starve or not, that's just your decision and you make that up. Everyone agrees that starving and starvation is bad, and hunger and extreme poverty is bad. Nobody's challenging this. What is challenged in post-development theory is this idea that there is this one thing called development, and every country has to reach this. So because they argue this is exactly part of the hierarchy that you're describing in your question, because the European and North American countries, they define what development is and what everyone has to reach, and they also define the ways in which this should be achieved, and thereby they wield power over the other countries. If, however, we challenge this whole idea of development and rather say, well, let's ask ourselves, what is a good life? And do we really need this economic development in the sense of the northern states to lead a good life? And then you can argue, no, we actually don't need that. We need something very different. We don't need to exploit nature to the extent that we would do under capitalist development. We don't need to build sweatshops where people work 12 or 14 hours a day to generate an export industry. That's not actually what makes lives better. So we just challenge this notion of development and find other ways to think about what is or is not desirable. So this is the point of post-development, not that there are only countries. This is something that I tried to sketch, by which I tried to sketch out the idea that there is not this idea of development, but they would not contest the fact that there are differences, only that they should not be measured in one notion of development. They certainly do not challenge the idea that there are global hierarchies. They actually have a strong focus on global hierarchies. Next question, why is that one of the main obstacles to development? There's quite a short answer to that. So if you are a very poor country that struggles to generate enough taxes to create schools or hospitals or whatever, and if you are a poor country that always suffers from a lack in foreign currency because you import more than you export, that's already bad enough. And if you then have to use, let's say, only 10% of your GDP in payment for interest and in debt service, then your situation is even worse. And 10% of the GDP is not that much if you compare it. So 10% of the GDP of Somalia is not much as compared to the GDP in Germany, but it's a lot of the resources of the country. So if a lot of these resources have to be tunneled out of the country to pay the debts with some banks in Europe or North America, then the situation of this country becomes even worse. And if they wouldn't have this debt payment, then they could build schools and hospitals and also have more foreign currency to import more stuff. So it's just a lot of money that you're losing. It's as if you have an income of $800 per month and you have to pay $200 on your taxes per month, on some debt cancellation per month. You will easily see that it's not a good thing for you economically. Next question, the USA are a country with huge debt. How come it can maintain its status as one of the most powerful and developed countries? This is in fact a very good question, because if you take all those measures by which poorer countries are measured in terms of debt and deficits, the USA would be very bad. They have a high current account deficit, and they also have a very high fiscal deficit, meaning the state regularly spends much more money than they earn, at least since the 1990s. Under Clinton, there were some years when they actually had a budget surplus. However, they have a high deficit ever since, and it's in general growing. So why does this work out for them? There are a few answers to this. One of them is that they have to pay much lower interest rates than poorer countries. So this is what we call the spread of interest rates. So if, let's say, the United States is maybe paying 1% of interest rates annually for their bonds they take, maybe then, I don't know, at some point Bolivia might have to pay 10 or 11% because the banks, they are not willing to give credit for the same low rates to them, because they do rely on the fact that the United States will always be there and will always be able to service its debts, where they have doubts about Bolivia. So if you're not so trustworthy creditor, then you'll have to pay more interest, and so it's much more of a problem there. Second part of the answer is the United States are the only country in the world that can simply print the currency they need to service their debt and their international debt also. It's kind of also true for, it's also true for Japan to a large extent. It's more complicated in the European Union and in Switzerland, but the United States, for them it's the case that every debt they have is in dollars, and dollars are the currency of the world, and they can just print dollars, so that also makes it easier for them. Next question concerns the debt trap. You show us in the lecture that there are some arguments for and against a relief of debt for some countries. We often talk about the less developed countries, but what about the debt of Greece, for example? Could there be a solid argument for the ECB to release the debt they have in order to let the economy grow again? I understand the argument that debt should always be paid and the risk in the future, but I think this is really necessary to restart the growth. The very short answer is yes, there is a solid case for debt relief for Greece, and there actually were some the debt was not totally cancelled, but parts of it were cancelled multiple times since the Greek debt crisis. And it was quite obvious, if you really looked at the data of the country, that Greece after the crisis had an amount of debt they were unable to repay, and forcing them to repay it would not make them able to repay. There was no way in which they would be able to repay these debts, and everybody kind of knew it. However, there were political problems about this. So, for example, much of the debt that the Greek state had was with banks in Germany and France. And these banks, where you could morally argue very well, if these banks are so stupid to buy so many government bonds from Greece, then it's their risk, and if Greek defaults on the debt, then they lose the money. Period. That's it. However, at this point in time, the European banking system was under a lot of stress, and the European governments were afraid if we have Greece default on the debt, then these banks lose more billions of euros, and then these banks might get destabilized, and then the whole European banking system might be destabilized, and this was a big point for not cancelling the Greek debt. And also the main problem with all of this is there is no clearly defined process for a country to go bankrupt. If you or me have too many debts to pay them and we don't have the income to repay them, then we can just in general default on our debt. There is a certain regulation in most countries of the world where it will say, well, we might not be allowed to found a new company or some economic enterprise over the next couple of years. We might not be allowed to take new debts over the next couple of years. And if we earn money over the next 5 years or 10 years, we'll have to pay most of our income to our debtors. And those are the rules for private bankruptcy. There are also rules for the cases in which a company goes bankrupt, but there are no clear rules for how a whole country can go bankrupt. And it's always then the politics start. And if you compare the cases of countries that went bankrupt over the last couple of decades, that defaulted on the debts over the last couple of decades, which was Mexico, Argentina, and Russia, for example, then there's a good case that it helps you if you have nuclear weapons, because Russia was let off the hook much more easily than Mexico or Argentina. So the general rule, if you want to default on your debt, you better have some nuclear weapons. One more point, maybe on the Greek case, it was even the case that the IMF, which was for a long time thought to be one of the badass neoliberal institutions that just force strict regimes on countries that they help, when they teamed up with the European institutions to manage the Greek crisis, they at some point said, well, we have to grant Greece a certain debt relief, otherwise we are out of it. It's just not sustainable to try to make them pay all the debts. However, they got a lot of pushback from Germany and from other northern European countries because they didn't want Greece to default on the debt. And part of what happened there was that, for example, German taxpayer money was given to Greece so that the Greeks then could repay their debt with the German banks. And then now they had it as a debt to Germany and had to repay to them. And then again, part of the debt was cancelled. So de facto, it was the case that the German banks gave credits to Greece that they shouldn't have given. And after the fact, Germany then at the end paid the German banks the money back. To some extent, at least that's what happened. It's a bit more complicated, but I leave it there. Next question, what do you think is the best solution to help the least developed countries? First, I would say it's a good first step to not always think about this in the notion of helping the least developed countries. Maybe it might be also worthwhile to think about that not harming the least developed countries. So something that the European countries could do quite easily is just cancelling debt of the least developed countries and also forcing banks to cancel the debt of the least developed countries or buy their debt, and to end agricultural subsidies in the European Union, or at least create equal opportunities for export from the least developed countries. This would already help a lot. And then you can of course also argue, and this would be a very hard political sell, that might be helpful to simply allow for migration from these countries, because then those migrants would pay remittances to the country, which would actually also help development there. And these are, most of them are all just things where the richer countries would just have to stop pursuing harmful policies. And I'm not saying that all problems in the world are the fault of the richer countries or so, but in some ways richer countries are actively hurting poorer countries, and if they just would stop doing so, that would already be something. Next, why does no approach of year 3 and from the textbook say anything regarding rule of law, transparency for companies, or that some degree of physical security is necessary? Some countries that are considered as failed states or affected by civil war, like Somalia, Nicaragua, Syria or Libya, or a country like North Korea, could probably open as much SEZs as they want without attracting many foreign companies. So what can they do beside overcoming violence? I think it was kind of there on my slide. The point that you're making here, this is something that would best line up with what I categorized there as a liberal approach of opening markets, so the second one in the middle, because there you would say what the state has to do, it has to stop intervening in the economy, but it has to create a stable framework. And this is the point where all this good governance ideas that you refer to here come into place. And these are exactly about the rule of laws, anti-corruption and transparency and security, and this is something that the state should safeguard. And I think there's a very good point for that. However, small side note, I'm not so sure if what you say about SEZs is 100% correct what you say there. I think if a totally dictatorial country that is corrupt to its teeth internally, if they created one special economic zone for foreign direct investment and export industries, and they just guarantee by international contracts that they will uphold the rule of law there, that they will not touch the property of international companies there, I think international companies wouldn't really mind if these countries in other regions are corrupt and transparent and don't have a rule of law and people are killed by the government. I mean, to some extent you even see this in a country such as China. It's very hard to argue that China is so good on the rule of law everywhere in the country, and also in other Asian countries that have these special economic zones that work. There's not a perfect rule of law everywhere in the country. What they indeed have to give a credible guarantee to the international investors that their investments won't be harmed. And this is actually something where SECs can work quite well, because they are kind of insulated from the normal politics and society of a country, and it can quite well work, and even for socialist countries, and there is even some precedent for that. So there is a special economic zone in North Korea, which attracts investment from China and Russia. And because why would a Russian company care for human rights and the rule of law in Pyongyang if they have their investment in some insulated special economic zones where some North Korean workers work for them cheaply, and they have the guarantee by the North Korean and the Russian state that their investment won't be harmed? That should be good enough for them. So what you say is right, it is an important part, it's especially part of the liberal argument for open markets. However, when it comes to special economic zones, it's not a necessary precondition there. Last question, to what extent is the system described by dependence theory and world system theory subject to change? It seems to me that they perceive development as strictly zero sum, so following the metaphor you applied, in order for a chicken to rise, another needs to be knocked down. The answer is yes and no there. So, and the way I sketched it with the chicken and the pyramid, this is exactly what they would say, and this is exactly what I wanted to say with the metaphor. And there are some tendencies to have this kind of zero-sum perspective on capitalist development, at least in these theories. However, this is only a very first approximation, and particularly within world system theory, there is a strong consciousness that the international system is also in transformation. And I think one can work very well with world system theory and still hold the notion that even within the capitalist world system, it would very well be possible to overcome the most extreme forms of poverty, not overcoming hierarchy in general, not overcoming global domination, expropriation. Those will be there as long as there's international capitalism, if you are a believer in world system theory. However, even in capitalist development, there is no necessity for people to starve or to die of extreme poverty. That's something that could be overcome in capitalist world system, even from a world systems theory perspective, at least as I read it. I hope that answers your question. Okay, so much for today. I almost stick to half an hour, so I'm getting better in this as we near towards the end. One last thing, in the evaluation, some of you wondered how I select these questions, and I can say at the beginning of the lecture, I really read every one of the 200 questions and then tried to group them and then select some questions that were representative of certain topics that many of you addressed. And this meant, since I receive roughly 200 or 300 questions per week, that it took me probably almost a whole workday to create this question and answers video, which just unfortunately was not sustainable. So what I do right now is I check if everyone handed in questions, and then I really quite randomly select 10 or 15 of them that I do address. And this is just as a measure of transparency. So it's a random thing. And if there are some among you who never had their question answered, I'm really sorry about this. I have no systematic preference, and I don't even really like filter for what I would call quality. So I try to answer questions that move beyond the reading and beyond the lecture, and with which I have struggled even answering them. And I also try to answer questions that just ask me to explain something again that has already been explained, and I just try to do it both, and I hope that already helps. Okay, then see you next week when we talk more, actually a little bit more about degrowth theory also, because then we will talk the political ecology of the international political economy. Okay, enjoy your weekend.